part the topic for today, which is going to be very exciting. It's about serious games for risk reduction planning, and it will be presented by two people, Michelina Kulakowska from the Center for System Solutions in Poland, and Bettina Koelle from the Red Crescent Climate Centre, who is based in South Africa. Who of you can I give the floor? Who is starting?
I will start,
Okay.
Internet permitting. Thank you, Kees. So we're going to do this in two parts. We're going to look at learning through dialogues and games as an introduction, and then Michelina will take us into some simulation work and experiences from their side to really deepen the discussion. So let me do a 20-minute overview. Then we'll have some time for questions. If you have questions, also please. The recording hasn't started yet. Kees, in the chat. I think the recording has started. Maybe not.
Yeah, I have it started. Yes.
Perfect. So we will look at how we can learn through dialogue and games. And I think we all have been in situations. Next slide. Where we work in complex systems and we think and we are aware that the contribution of science is really important. And there are two really important assumptions here. The first assumption is that scientific publications transform policy and practice. We write a scientific paper and magically it will impact on policy and practice and change the world for the better. The other assumption is that projects are really very effective vehicles for change. Even if they're short term, they actually change the world for the better. And here are a couple of thoughts on these two assumptions. The one assumption on the scientific publication is that often research is quite extractive, and often the research results are inaccessible to stakeholders from policy and practice. They're too theoretical, they may be published in journals that people don't have access to, and this can be really challenging. The second assumption on projects being an effective vehicle for change is that often projects are very short term, they're very small focus, narrow focus, they have a limited scope, and therefore they're really not always look at the long term. So how can games, serious games, collaborative dialogues, and experiential learning help us to address some of these challenges? On the one hand, they really provide a fantastic tool for collaboration. People will have joint experiences by going through simulations or games. They will bring their different knowledges to a joint purpose, and they can therefore co-produce new knowledge based on what they are bringing to the table. And also, it is up to us to really think about how these processes that we're engaged in really contribute to ongoing long-term processes, to really support and foster a longer-term thinking, to work with visions, and to really think about the transformative aspects of our work. So scientific publications and projects have an important role to play. And yet the argument here is it is good to zoom out a bit and say, in the bigger picture, what do we need to consider when we think about scientific publications and projects? How can they make an effective contribution to a transformative adaptation process? Next slide, please. So we talked a little bit about co-production earlier, and I think it is really important to say that co-production in this presentation we use as a word to describe a process of sharing and learning that actually produces new knowledge. So it is not just about three people sharing their knowledge, but it is actually that what emerges is co-produced and is new knowledge. And the partners could be varied. They could be from they could be all from academia, but from different disciplines. There could be a range of different types of organizations or sectors. And the idea is what brings people together is really that people say we value all perspectives, and we understand that everyone brings their own knowledge to this process, and therefore we can have a better understanding of the system as a whole. Next slide, please. So I will take you through a couple of examples from Lusaka. Lusaka is in Zambia, and it's been one of the cities that was part of a fractal project, limited to a number of years, 4.5 years in the end, looking at how we can support cities to make better decisions in the long term. And so there were climate scientists on the team, social scientists, facilitators, and there were, of course, 9 cities in Southern Africa with a whole range of partners, as you can see here. And next slide, please. So we looked at, where do we want to go? Who should be part of this journey? And how do we want to travel along this road? And we said, instead of doing the traditional way of saying, we are putting together the science, we're having some policy briefs, and then we do the advocacy, the capacity development, outreach work, we said, how about we turn it upside down? And we first reach out to the cities and say, where do you think are your burning problems? Where do you think are the key issues? Who should be part of this conversation? And can we pick one burning issue that we think we need to start with? Next slide, please. And so what emerged was not a linear process, but quite a messy process you can see here. So we started at the left, where you see the little explosion sign with the burning problem. Where do we want to start? We had a series of workshops that were interactive and explorative, involving lots of games and applied improv activities. We had trainings, we had one-on-one consultation, we had research, interview sessions, lectures, field trips, and all of it was brought together where the red hands are. Those are the city learning labs, where all the different stakeholders came together and made sense of the new information that had emerged and planned the next steps forward. This is a city learning lab process that will really allow us to learn as a longer term process and not as a once-off event. Next slide, please. So you see, we used all sorts of methods. We used Polaroid photographs. We made sure people arrived as individuals. And this is, I think, a real power of games and interactive processes and simulations. It allows people to let go a little bit of their own agendas, their organizational sort of persona that they bring to workshops, and to be there and engage with each other as individuals. Next slide. It was also really important to do field trips. The burning issue identified in Lusaka was around water, drinking water provision of good quality as a challenge, and also a challenge of flooding if there are too many in the event of extreme rainfall. And so we looked at where the drinking water was coming from. Next slide, please. And we also looked at the underground waterworks from Lusaka, supplying Lusaka with water. Next slide, please. In the process, we explored these systems and we called it mass mapping. I think we also call it here impact chains, a similar kind of thinking. Maybe one more click. And I think it emerged, and this was a reflection of one of the participants, how complex the system is and how important it is to really have these different perspectives to understand the complexity as much as possible in going forward. Next slide, please. We also looked at who are the actual actors and where are barriers of communication, who should be part of this process but is not, and therefore who should be included. And I think it's really, really important to say that the co-production process that has a lot of interactive exercises is really relying very heavily on there being a diversity of knowledge, a diversity of perspectives in the room, So you can really work with a bit of the tension and to really understand a lot of the challenges. Next slide. And so at the end of the journey, and another click or two, is we reflected and we said, how was this journey of some years to explore? And we took a lot of unexpected turns because the group felt we now need to explore this area, and it was not part of the proposal. So part of having these processes also means letting go of control a little bit. And interesting reflection is now I can listen more and better to the other opinions. And next click, please. And I think it was also important to say that we need a flexible mind for dynamic problems. And this is maybe where I want to say flexible minds and a collaborative spirit are really key in complex dialogues. And serious games, simulations, and experiential learning can really help us to engage with that complexity and a flexible mind. Quite briefly, I want to touch base on the climate risk narratives. Next slide. So this is one of the tools that I wanted to pick out because it proved to be exceptionally useful to make the linkages between science and policymakers. And we used it in Lusaka. So I thought I'll pick out this as an example. Next slide. This is my colleague Chris Jack from the University of Cape Town in Lusaka, presenting climate science. And the idea is that we need sound climate science to formulate what can happen in the cities. So the city officials said, what will happen next? And they wanted to know some precise information. And we said, well, we can't say for sure what will happen next year in a particular month, but there are some things we can say. And so we developed 3 possible scenarios for future climate that were part of the spectrum of what we thought was possible in terms of the climate science. So there's a lot of underlying climate science, and we picked 3 scenarios that we thought were in the range of possible. And we explored the effect and impact in all 3 scenarios. We said, can we understand the complexity of the system? Can we explore different perspectives? And can we identify where are the areas that we need to pay most attention? Where are most vulnerable groups affected? And what does it mean for policymakers? Next slide. So here you see Chris Jack giving a climate science presentation to policymakers. Policymakers were not very engaged, and they said, tell us what will happen and we will engage. So next slide. We took a step of looking at the mapping of the mass mapping, and we said, what is actually happening here? Under the different scenarios, how will these systems that we have mapped out here, how will they be affected? Next slide. We then examined in the field, what would the scenarios, what would the impact of these scenarios be? And we had 3 scenarios, and we said, what are societal consequences of these impacts? What could possible responses be? And next slide. And we role played with participants what these scenarios would feel like in terms of impact for society, for different sectors, from their perspectives. And it really brought to life that these scenarios were going to be impactful to the Zambian society, especially in Lusaka. And next slide. So we invited policymakers to a high-level breakfast where not the scientists or the external team was presenting, but the Learning Lab participants themselves were presenting their experience from working with the 3 scenarios. And next slide, please. We're giving a picture of saying, what climate are we expecting for Lusaka? What is the range of challenges that we are dealing with? And what are some very concrete policy recommendations? And the next ones we can go through quite quickly. So we looked at the climate science. Next slide, to say Lusaka is already warmed by 1 degree. We looked at the rainfall that has actually been increased, but also the variability has increased. So we looked into the past. We also looked into the future. Next slide. What were the predictions in terms of variability of rainfall, not just in Lusaka, but also in the catchment of the Kafue, where Lusaka gets its drinking water from? Next slide, please. And next slide, please. And so what is interesting and important is here to say that the Kafue and Lusaka region will continue warming into the future. And it's possible that there'll be a drying in the future, but it is also likely that the rainfall will be more intense if it rains less. These are too generic for planners to work with. Next slide, please. So what we did is we developed these scenarios. You can see here, the first scenario was like it's getting hotter and drier. The second scenario was warmer and more erratic and extreme rainfall. And the other one is warmer and more extreme rainfall, but not more erratic. And we looked at these and we said, what are the impacts on the natural system? Where are areas that are particularly impacted? What are consequences for society? And what are some possible responses? And this is what the policymakers found most useful. They were saying, now we see, this is the range that we're dealing with. And we can see, interestingly enough, a lot of the responses relate to good sustainable management of the city. And therefore, a lot of the responses are actually covering a range of scenarios. Next slide. So what does it mean? It means that when we design processes that are interactive and experiential, we need to take care for them to really be engaging, for people to really feel free and have the courage to share their knowledge, to make it a more robust and more inclusive process, but also to make the knowledge that is created more robust and more inclusive. I think it is crucial in this case of the learning labs that the delegates were driving their own learning process. We are facilitators. We're there to enable. We're not there to dictate, and we're not there to give people the knowledge that we think they should be using. It's a two-way process, and it's a partner process. And I think in facilitating these processes, it is really important to be effective as facilitators, to have a good process, to have a nice flow, to make sure people really feel like it was worth coming to this process, and we're looking forward to coming to the next one. And every process will be slightly different. So there's an element of magic, surprise, and something unexpected happening as well to really ease ourselves into the deeper learning process. And next slide. Hopefully, these kind of activities can allow us to be less overwhelmed when we think of our sort of challenging systems and complexity that we're dealing with, and to really start getting to grips and to work with how we can imagine a better future, and to really think with stakeholders and partners in how we can manage to do that together. And I'll leave it at this. I hope maybe we can open the floor for a couple of minutes for questions. And otherwise, I want to say special thanks for Michelina for guiding so expertly the PowerPoint slides. And let's see if you have any comments or questions at all. The floor is open. So silence could mean that I've lost connection and no one could hear me in the last 20 minutes. Or it could mean there are no questions.
We can still hear you. We can still hear you.
Very good. Very good. All right. Seems to be no questions. Well,
maybe that people have to digest it further, but then maybe after Michelina's part, there's of course again opportunity to ask questions. So, yeah.
Great. With this, then I hand over to Michelina to take us through a couple of more exciting options and how really deal with complexity and how to engage people in a process that is engaging and inspiring. Michelina, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Bettina. It was very interesting. As was mentioned, we will leave some additional time after my presentation. So if you still have any questions for Bettina, please don't worry, you will have time for that. With that, I would like to start, and I will be starting from one of the points that Bettina mentioned. So designing the process to make the magic happen. This is what I would like to focus on today. So how this process of designing the magic could look like, to give you some context of the PARATUS project, how it could look within the PARATUS project, and give you some additional examples of games that were implemented in the past, how they were developed. So maybe let me start with a bit of summary of what Bettina actually mentioned when describing the whole process. What is important for stakeholders, what is important to include in a process like that, and also in serious games or social simulations, how we call it. So we are all aware of global challenges. We are all aware of different risks. We did a lot of work within different case studies, did a lot of digging in the past. But there are, as also Bettina already mentioned, there's a lot of complexity, and it's not always easy to understand it. We need some ways to untangle this complexity. We need some ways to combat the uncertainty or accept the uncertainty that comes from this complexity. We are not always able to see the consequences of our actions, especially in the long term. This is also obviously one of the reasons why the PARATUS project exists. We want to have more predictable ways of dealing with disasters. We also interpret the reality differently. Our perception is often colored by different values and worldviews. This is also why different approaches, different priorities are important to showcase. The individuals, like in the Lusaka process, it's important to show that everyone could have different way to apprehend world, and we need to look for shared ways to do that. And though very often a lot of people understand the situation they are in, again, they see the problem, but they don't always know how to react to it. They don't know what this one problem could also affect. What are the impacts on it, on other situations? on other challenges that they are dealing with in their day-to-day life. And science modeling is very helpful to deal with those questions, to provide some answers. But we need to involve stakeholders. This is very important for us. We've heard Bettina describing the co-production of the knowledge, and very important element of the whole process is obviously bridging the gap between research, policymakers and also general public, and we need different approaches to do that. Like, for example, mass mapping or creating scenarios. We also heard a lot of things about scenarios last week. Important for tools like this is that they are reflexive and conceptual. So we don't really need tools that will directly point us to the right answers, because projects are usually short, right? So we need something that would make participants, users of those tools, reflect on the situation, understand the situation, come to their own conclusion, and be able to use this conclusion to work in the long term, to create some long-term change in their behavior or in the system that they operate in. A tool that could enable some experimentation, trying to make solutions to their problem on their own, like, again, scenario making, anticipatory scenario mapping, different kinds of systems mapping that can support such learning and gathering, knowledge sharing within stakeholders. And then something that could help with approaching problems in more systemic ways, recognizing possible domino effects, which again comes from this complexity of problems that we work with. And as you saw, if you participated in some of the stakeholder workshops in the PARATUS, or saw some of the impact chains that were created, the complexity is there. There will be domino effects, and the stakeholders have to learn how to deal with them. But at the same time, and here I will again bring it back to what Bettina was saying, communication and collaboration is very important. This is something that is often missing in scientific models. The human factor, what is the attitude of stakeholders to certain solutions, what were their experiences, personal experiences, work experiences, attitudes towards other stakeholders, different conflicts, or even emotional investments in certain cases, certain problems. We need something that would enable users to confront those human factors within the system that is already very, very complex. So how we can actually do this? And this is where simulation comes in, games and simulations. very big factor here is that we can have players in different roles having some role play, but putting it in the certain context of a problem or challenge, and enable them to work in a kind of fail-proof environment. And there is already a lot of serious games and simulations that actually touch on the topic of disaster risk management and reduction planning. A few years ago, there was an article where at least 45 of games like this were described, all non-commercial, all possible to use in different situations. But actually, a lot of those simulations were quite simple. A lot of those games mostly focused on very short-term solutions, on reaction to disasters. Not many of them actually involve long-term planning and mitigation of the risk. And this is something where PARATUS actually can come in, since there is a big need for simulations that not only take into account this small part of the system that concerns disasters, but also enable users to look a bit wider on the whole system and the complexity of various elements that affect how this risk management reduction planning goes, and how it can be implemented. For example, budgetary, cultural, political implications in specific situations that we are looking at. The learnings from this article motivated us, meaning my organization, including me, into creating a process that would enable us to create this magic. So how to exactly develop a game that could be a catalyst for social learning, how we can do it, and how can we do it with the involvement of stakeholders, and what we can actually receive from it, and what can stakeholders receive from such experience. So what this process describes is actually going from the real world problem situation. So in case of the PARATUS project, that's a lot of inputs we already have. We have well described case studies. We have some plans for scenarios. We have the learning labs that also will provide the inputs, and we had a lot of meetings with stakeholders where the case study leaders received data, knowledge, and information from stakeholders, what is important from their perspective. And now, taking that, we can segregate this knowledge, this real situation into a few boxes. So we have problem and situation, which we aim to improve with some specific plans, strategies, decisions, actions. But at the same time, we also have some resources, systems, governance, and public discourse that have to be taken into account when it comes to strategies, decisions, and actions. Then this real world situation, this real world problem, what we are learning from the stakeholders has to be put in the simulation. So how can this be done? So first of all, we have some general principles guiding the game design. We also, some of you, I believe, also heard a bit about design of the process in general. So all those principles, like knowing the target groups or their needs, sometimes creating personas for the end users, etc., they all apply here. But for the game design, we also have two important elements here. First one is the procedural rhetoric. So how people learn through the authorship of rules and processes. So how each process from the real world can be translated into the game design, and how people will actually learn by doing certain things within the limitations of the game. And then second one, which again is something that motivated us to even start planning for this process, which is social learning, observing other people with the goal of adapting one's behavior in social context. So learning by imitating, learning by observing others, which is second very important element there. And under those principles, the simulation is co-designed with stakeholders and researchers. And the translation of the real world problems have to come into that fruition. Usually the co-design means not only receiving the information from the stakeholders, but also testing the simulation, testing the game with stakeholders, and through trial and errors, making the simulation, making the game that the stakeholders actually feel, reflect what they experience in the real world, at least to some extent, and can feel that they actually co-authored and improved the simulation by participating in the tests. So how does this translation into game structure, game design actually looks like? So first of all, and this also was a part of Bettina simulation, we need to think what kind of roles, what kind of actors are important in the real world setting, who has to be represented, who has to be involved in this in the game. So do we need first responders there? What kind of agencies, local or public or central administration do we need there? what kind of groups of interests do we need in the simulation? Then what kind of interactions those groups should have? Do they all have to be represented? Do they all have to be playable? What kind of decisions those roles could take? What kind of decisions they can take in the real world? How does it affect the situation? And what kind of resource each of this role can actually have. So we know for a fact that budgetary limitations all very often come to play. So that can be one. There is also time limits. There are also some other resources that could be necessary to put in the simulation, put in the system, like for example, staff resources that actually very highly affect the situation. So what could they be? For example, one of the simulations that we designed, flat resilience game, which was actually co-developed with IASA. Some of our partners may have heard about this. Represents a community living in an area exposed to floods, occurring with different severity, and then players play different roles, farmers, for example, but also local authorities, local entrepreneurs, refugees, I believe, and also some other groups of interest, and they all have to deal with certain situation and are limited by the resources that are provided from them based on the inputs of the research and stakeholders we've worked with. The roles have specific actions to undertake based on the Zurich flood resilience measurement tools, and they very closely resemble the real actions. But not every action can also be implemented by every role. So every role have to have some limitations. Public administration would probably be able to implement big scale projects that can encompass and increase the safety of the whole river valley, but then individuals and groups of interest would not be able to do that, but they could possibly affect what kind of long-term solutions the administration has. And one of the questions here is actually how they can do it and in what ways public can affect the situation that they themselves can become the victim of. The more real-like the simulation is, which flat resilience simulation is quite real-like in a sense that it has very specific actions. The longer it can get, because the level of complexity can also be much higher. So here, for example, besides management of the risk, players still have to face day-to-day problems. So there is education system in place, there is health system in place, which have to be provided for. The level of education of each individual can also affect how much money they have for their own risk management on individual level. So what is going on here is actually showcasing how this disaster risk management falls into the business as usual, or maybe like day-to-day scenario, and how this crisis can affect also different areas, different sectors of the world that we are representing. But as you can see, this complexity is also translated into time. So, for example, flat resilience game can last even 4 hours because it's complex and needs some time for players to actually manage all those elements of complexity. But they can do it. They can do it in one environment, which is something that we wanted to achieve here. Just to have this magic happen, but in one very compact block, very compact workshop. But very important is looking for a good balance between complexity, likeness to the real world, and the simplification. The more real-like it becomes, the less universal it will be. The more simple it will be, less there will be less likeness to the real life, and with more complexity, it will be more difficult for players to understand. And all of those aspects are actually tested in the simulation performance. So in real life, I've mentioned before that co-design comes from the testing and meeting with stakeholders, involving them in the simulation, testing what is missing from the system that we are representing, and being able to add that. This all come crashing down in workshops. The workshops can create a very immersive situation where players are actively challenged, not only by the situation, but also by this role play, which again is very important element here, because we want them to actually challenge each other with those worldviews, with different discourses and different approaches to the situation. And here are a few methods of involving the stakeholders. So sometimes involving stakeholders in their real life roles can be very interesting to enable them to test specific plans from their point of view, but it can be also very interesting to switch roles. So, for example, enable citizens to play in the position of power, to see how difficult it can be, but also to possibly propose some solutions that usual administration would not think about in this situation. Usually game sessions, so this performance also can be boxed in few particular parts. So players' experience is very important, that comes in the gameplay. And after the gameplay, we follow with the reflection. Why this reflection is important, we call it debriefing, is because to enable more inputs from the stakeholder group, we need to make the games more open-ended, being able to incorporate the ideas from the stakeholders within the simulation. And for example, that's exactly what we did in Lima, Peru with the flat resilience game. So these experiences are taken, these experiences discussed in the debriefing, where players can reflect on the outcomes of the game, will transform into outcomes of the game session. And by the outcomes of the game session, we usually understand the willingness to collaborate, but also the deeper understanding of the underlying system, the elements that there are there, and understanding what is missing in the real life. So very important element of the game outcomes should always be bridging the experience from the game into the real life, so that those game outcomes can actually affect the decisions and actions in the real life. If there are any specific ideas created in the game, they can be transferred with the help of the facilitation, which again, going to Bettina's presentation, is important part of the experience, into something that could be used in the real world, even if there are none of the specific solutions or ideas, then we still will have the willingness to collaborate, understanding that that talking with other stakeholders is of great importance, even if that was something that was obvious for stakeholders before such experiencing situations like this will always be more impactful than only knowing something. There is big difference between those two elements. And as our research showed us, usually the games we've developed were very impactful when it comes to understanding the system. So here is a short summary based on our article on the Nexus game. What have you learned from the simulation? So systems thinking and society. And this was a simulation created based on this process diagram I've showed you throughout my presentation. The other thing that is here very important and very much applicable to PARATUS project is actually governance, policy and politics part of the simulation, and the society part of simulation, because those two parts of groups involved in problems in case studies usually have the biggest gaps of knowledge and power between each other. So there is a big gap between, for example, first responders, scientists, and policymakers versus also citizens that are affected directly by some risks. playing the simulation could lower this gap and create experience that is shared among stakeholders, which is always also a positive outcome of the workshop like this. And another thing we've discovered is that the experience like this can actually inspire players to take an action in real world. And again, it's those two things that are the most common: the governance, policy, and politics. So making some changes in the planning, and then also understanding and untangling the system thinking, looking for interconnectedness between different responsibilities or requirements to solve the situation at hand. So just to look at it from the perspective of real world versus game world, we have real world problems that through the game design can create some outcomes that could be translated into real world actions that the game should in some way support. And again, this is a bit more compact view on that. So what's hidden and what can be visible later in the real world. We have simulation performance, which is the game workshop, game test. The code design is more hidden because we get from the simulation performance some inputs, and this is all designed within the simulation. We have mental models, so original attitudes of the stakeholders to the situation that through the simulation performance can affect problem situation. So mental models change, problem situation could also change, which is what we would like to achieve. And this way we circle through all of the steps again: real world problem, simulation co-design, simulation performance, reflecting on the situation and being able to affect the real world problem situation. The simulation performance, simulation debriefing can be multiplied through disseminating the game, disseminating the ways to organize something like this in more complex, in more compact ways, because, and this was something that Bettina mentioned, the process has to have rules and has to have specific flow, and the game is very good in creating environment like this, which makes dissemination of games itself quite easy. And even if the whole long process of multiple workshops where we gather data from the stakeholders, where we are able to share with them our findings, is not possible, it's always easier to propose something that can be prepared in compact workshop, which is not ideal, of course, but can still bring forward some interesting outcomes to all parties involved. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen. Sorry for talking for so long. Do you have any questions?